A man came home from war, and nobody asked where he had been. His name was William Swarbrick. He had served 12 months with the 20th Field Regiment, Royal Artillery, in a country most of his friends could not find on a map. When he returned to Britain and told them where he had been, they asked him where Korea was. Not rhetorically, they genuinely did not know. There was no homecoming party, there was no parade. There was a question about geography, and then the conversation moved on. What you are about to discover is what Swarbrick was part of. 100,000 British soldiers served in Korea between 1950 and 1953. Over 1,000 of them never came home. The war they fought has never officially ended. The country they defended remembers them. The country that sent them does not. Why do you think that is? Tell me in the comments. Stay with this, because what happened to the men Britain sent to Korea, and what Britain then did with the memory of what happened to them, is a story that has been sitting in the record for 70 years, waiting for someone to read it properly. The world that produced that silence was assembled from a specific sequence of decisions, and the first of them was made before a single British soldier set foot on the Korean peninsula. Korea had been occupied by Japan since 1910. 40 years of colonial rule, of Koreans conscripted into Japan's wartime army, of a national identity suppressed by an imperial administration that had no intention of relinquishing its hold. When Japan surrendered in August of 1945, the question of what happened to Korea next was settled in the space of a single conversation between American and Soviet officials. The solution they arrived at was a line drawn along the 38th parallel north, dividing the peninsula into two occupation zones. The Americans took the south, the Soviets took the north. The line was described as temporary. It was not temporary. Under Soviet supervision, the North hardened into the Democratic People's Republic of Korea under Kim Il-sung, a former anti-Japanese guerrilla fighter who had spent years in the Soviet Union and returned to Korea in the Soviet Army's baggage. Under American supervision, the South became the Republic of Korea under Syngman Rhee, a conservative nationalist who had spent decades in exile lobbying for Korean independence. Both governments claimed sovereignty over the entire peninsula. Neither accepted the division as permanent. The occupying powers withdrew their forces in 1948, leaving behind two states armed and aligned with opposing superpowers, separated by a border neither recognized. Then, on the 12th of January, 1950, the American Secretary of State, Dean Acheson, made a speech in Washington defining the American sphere of interest in Asia. He drew a line on a map. Korea fell outside it. Stalin read the speech. Kim Il-sung had already been pressing Moscow for permission to act. In February of 1950, Stalin gave his consent to a North Korean invasion of the South. At 4 a.m. on the 25th of June, 1950, the North Korean People's Army crossed the 38th parallel in force. Neither South Korean nor American intelligence had detected the buildup with sufficient clarity to act on it. The surprise was complete. South Korean forces collapsed. American forces rushed in from Japan were pushed back with them. Within weeks, North Korean troops had conquered almost the entire peninsula, leaving Allied forces clinging to a defensive perimeter around the southern port of Pusan. The United Nations Security Council met in emergency session. The Soviet representative was absent, having boycotted the council since January over Communist China's exclusion. Without his veto, Resolution 83 passed. Member nations were called on to support South Korea. The absence of one diplomat from one meeting made the difference between a war and an occupation. In London, Prime Minister Clement Attlee's cabinet met and arrived at a conclusion stated in its minutes with the clarity of a moral imperative. It was, the cabinet recorded, the clear duty of the United Kingdom government to do everything in their power to help the South Koreans resist this aggression. The language was unambiguous. The military reality beneath it was considerably more complicated. Britain in the summer of 1950 was a country that had lost 384,000 service personnel in the Second World War and 70,000 civilians. The National Health Service was 2 years old. Rationing of some foods would continue until 1954. The army Attlee was preparing to commit to a war on the other side of the world was exhausted, under-equipped, and stretched across an empire that was simultaneously contracting. It was not an army looking for a new conflict. The conflict had found it. The first British ground forces to reach Korea were the 27th Infantry Brigade, based in Hong Kong, deployed in August and September of 1950. They were understrength. They lacked organic artillery and armored support. The Americans provided much of what the brigade needed to function. They were not all volunteers in the conventional sense. Attlee's government had introduced the National Service Act in 1948, establishing peacetime conscription for the first time in British history outside of wartime. From the 1st of January, 1949, all healthy males between the ages of 17 and 21 were required to serve 18 months in the armed forces. In October of 1950, in direct response to Korea, the service period was extended to 2 years. The young men receiving their papers in 1950 and 1951 did not know, when the letter arrived, that a war in a country most of them could not have located on a map had changed the terms of their obligation. In September of 1950, General Douglas MacArthur executed an amphibious landing at Incheon on the western coast of Korea. The landing severed the North Korean supply lines. The North Korean army collapsed. UN forces pushed north rapidly. By late October, American units had reached the Yalu River on the Chinese border. MacArthur told his men they would be home by Christmas. The intelligence that Chinese forces had been massing on the Korean border was available. MacArthur dismissed it. On the 19th of October, 1950, Chinese forces crossed the Yalu in strength, not in the thousands, but in the hundreds of thousands. The UN advance collapsed. Seoul fell again in January of 1951, leaving the city largely in ruins. Attlee flew to Washington to express his alarm directly to President Truman. MacArthur's public threats of escalation, including references to nuclear weapons, led Truman to relieve him of command in April of 1951. General Matthew Ridgway replaced him. The front stabilized roughly along the 38th parallel. The war MacArthur had promised would end by Christmas of 1950 was about to settle into 2 more years of grinding, costly stalemate. 2/3 of the British soldiers who served in Korea were national servicemen, or recalled reservists, men who had already served in the Second World War and been pulled back into uniform. The average age of frontline infantry was 19. Many officers commanding them were Second World War veterans, leading boys who had been in primary school when that war ended. Among those men, 2 battalions stand at the center of what Britain actually did in Korea. The 1st Battalion of the Gloucestershire Regiment, the Gloucesters, had sailed from Southampton on the 1st of October, 1950, 890 officers and men, bound for a country most of them had never heard of. Commanding them was Lieutenant Colonel James Power Carn, born in 1906. A professional soldier, quiet and steady. The kind of officer whose adjutant would later describe his leadership as inspiring confidence without drama. What he could not have known, standing on the deck of his troopship in October of 1950, was that the action he was sailing toward would earn him the Victoria Cross, and that he would not see Britain again for more than 3 years. The Gloucesters were part of the 29th Independent Infantry Brigade Group, commanded by Brigadier Tom Brodie. The brigade comprised the 1st Battalion Royal Northumberland Fusiliers, the 1st Battalion Royal Ulster Rifles, the Belgian United Nations Command, and a substantial supporting arm, including Centurion tanks of the 8th King's Royal Irish Hussars and the guns of the 45th Field Regiment Royal Artillery. By late 1951, the war had settled into a form that veterans and military historians consistently compare to the First World War. The comparison is not rhetorical, it is accurate. Trenches, dugouts the men called hoochies, night patrols through no man's land in darkness and cold, artillery exchanges that could last hours without either side moving. The average age of the men in those trenches was 19. The war's official description was a police action. The men in the hoochies had a different description, though most of them kept it to themselves. The Chinese Spring Offensive of April 1951 had a specific objective: to punch through the United Nations line, cross the Imjian River, and drive south to capture Seoul. 3 divisions of the Chinese 63rd Army, approximately 27,000 men, were assigned to break the sector held by the 29th British Infantry Brigade, positioned approximately 25 miles northwest of the South Korean capital. The road through the brigade's position led directly to the city. On the night of the 22nd of April, 1951, a Gloucester's listening post near the Imjian River detected movement in the darkness. Tommy Clough, a mortarman attached to the Gloucesters, was positioned on Castle Hill with a pair of binoculars. What he saw when he focused them on the gap in the hills across the river has been in his testimony ever since. There was a gap in the hills, he recalled, and he could not believe his eyes. It was like looking at ants swarming out of a nest. There were literally thousands of Chinese, and it took his breath away. Karn acted immediately. He sent Lieutenant Guy Temple forward with 16 men to ambush the main crossing point. The patrol watched as 7 Chinese soldiers stepped into the waters of the Imjian. They cut down all 7. 3 more crossing attempts followed. The patrol killed approximately 70 Chinese before their ammunition ran low, and they withdrew. The ambush bought time. It did not stop what was coming. Through the night of the 22nd and the day of the 23rd, the Gloucesters fought on multiple hill positions simultaneously as Chinese forces sought to surround them. A company, reduced by this point to 1 wounded officer and 53 men, withdrew under heavy fire to Hill 235, west of the village of Sault-Marie. Hill 235 was the Gloucester's last position. It would acquire a different name. By the first light of the 24th of April, the Gloucesters were effectively surrounded. A relief force was assembled. The Centurion tanks of the 8th Hussars advanced as far as they could. They were stopped 2,000 yards short. The terrain defeated them. The relief did not arrive. On the morning of the 25th of April, with ammunition nearly exhausted and no relief in sight, Karn gave the order to break out in small groups and make for friendly lines. Of approximately 700 men who had gone into the battle, only a handful escaped. The rest were killed, wounded, or captured. Before a company's survivors made their withdrawal from Castle Hill, Lieutenant Philip Curtis had seen a Chinese machine gun position that was cutting them down. Curtis was 26 years old, on attachment from the Duke of Cornwall's light infantry. He attacked the position. He destroyed it. He was killed doing it. His action allowed the survivors to move. His name is on the Imjin roll. Hill 235, where the Gloucesters made their final stand, was renamed by the South Koreans after the battle. They called it Gloucester Hill. They have called it that ever since. The numbers from the Imjin were exact, and they were devastating. The Gloucestershire Regiment suffered 620 casualties, killed, wounded, or missing. 522 soldiers were taken prisoner. 180 of those were wounded when captured. 34 died in captivity. 59 were killed in action. On the 27th of April, the regiment could muster 217 men. The Chinese 63rd Army lost over a third of its combat strength and was pulled out of the line. Seoul did not fall. The regiment that was destroyed at the Imjin had, in being destroyed, held the road to the capital. The United States Army awarded the 1st Battalion Gloucestershire Regiment the Presidential Unit Citation, the highest American collective award for heroism, presented by General James Van Fleet in May of 1951. 2 Victoria Crosses were awarded to Karn for his leadership throughout the battle and his conduct in captivity, to Curtis posthumously for Castle Hill. James Karn spent 2.5 years in Chinese and North Korean captivity. The conditions there were specific and severe. Malnutrition was systematic, forced marches in conditions that had already broken men physically, solitary confinement as punishment for resistance, political indoctrination classes, systematic re-education programs designed to turn United Nations captives against Western imperialism. The term used for what happened to some of these men had not previously existed. A journalist named Edward Hunter coined it in 1950 to describe the changes in belief and behavior that captivity could produce in men who showed no obvious signs of mental illness or coercion. He called it brainwashing. The word entered the English language from Korea. Most people who use it today have no connection in their minds to the war that produced it. One of the men captured when Seoul fell in June of 1950 was not a soldier. His name was George Blake. He was a British intelligence officer at the British Embassy in Seoul when North Korean forces entered the city. During his captivity, he offered to pass material to the Soviet KGB on his return to Britain. He returned. He passed the material for years, including information about the Berlin spy tunnel, a joint British-American operation to tap Soviet communications in divided Berlin. He was unmasked and arrested in April of 1961, sentenced to 42 years, at the time the longest sentence handed down by a British court. In 1966, he escaped from Wormwood Scrubs prison and made his way to Moscow. He lived there until his death in 2020. The Korean War produced him. Armistice talks had begun at Panmunjom in July of 1951. They would continue for 2 years. The central dispute was prisoner repatriation. Communist China demanded the immediate return of all prisoners under the Geneva Convention. The United States refused. While the argument continued, men died. The price of a year in Korea for a British infantry regiment was approximately 40 to 50 killed and 200 to 250 wounded, paid over and over for positions that did not move. In the spring of 1953, with the armistice perhaps weeks away, the Chinese moved against a position the United Nations forces had been defending for the better part of 2 years. It was called the Hook. The Hook was a crescent-shaped ridge 120 meters above sea level near the Samachon River. Its position controlled the entrance to the Samachan Valley, and through that valley lay Seoul. For the Chinese negotiators at Panmunjom, capturing the Hook before the ceasefire gave them concrete leverage. The tactical logic was cold and clear. The unit defending the Hook was the 1st Battalion of the Duke of Wellington's regiment. The Dukes had sailed from Britain in September of 1952, landed at Pusan in October, and joined the 29th Brigade. They were largely national servicemen. The Duke of Wellington's regiment carried battle honors from the Alma, from Corunna, from the Somme, from Burma. To those honors, it was about to add one more. The Dukes took up positions on the Hook on the 12th and 13th of May, relieving the Black Watch. Between arrival and the main assault, they suffered 50 casualties from artillery and mortar fire before the battle history records had even begun. On the 18th of May, a Chinese deserter crossed no man's land and reported a large attack was imminent. The decision was made to leave the Dukes in position. They knew the ground. Whatever was coming, they would face it with knowledge a fresh battalion would not have. The night of the 28th of May began with artillery. The Chinese opened with approximately 11,000 shells, including over 200 in a single hour. When the bombardment paused, the infantry came. More than 6,500 Chinese soldiers moved against the Hook. The Dukes were outnumbered more than 4 to 1. British and American artillery responded with 37,818 shells and 325 rockets. The Dukes engaged in close quarters fighting, grenades, bayonets, and in places hand-to-hand combat in the trenches. At 3:30 in the morning of the 29th of May, the Dukes secured the Hook. The cost was 3 officers and 17 other ranks killed, 2 officers and 84 other ranks wounded, and 20 men missing, most confirmed later as prisoners of war. Chinese casualties were estimated at 250 dead and 800 wounded. Brigadier Kendrew visited the battlefield afterwards. His words have been in the record since he spoke them. "My God, those Dukes were marvelous," he said. "In the whole of the last war, I never saw anything like that bombardment." The battle honor awarded to the regiment was the Hook, 1953. The Duke of Wellington's regiment's headquarters company was renamed Hook Company in commemoration. The battle it commemorates does not appear in most British school history curricula. At 2200 hours on the 27th of July, 1953, the fighting stopped. The Korean Armistice Agreement was signed at Panmunjom. Those who were still alive put down their weapons. They went home. William Swarbrick went home. His friends asked him where he had been. They didn't know where Korea was. There was no homecoming party. This was not an unusual experience. It was the standard one. The Korean War had been officially framed not as a war, but as a police action, a United Nations commitment, rather than a British conflict. This framing denied the veterans the status that the word war confers. Nobody threw parades for police actions. The cultural record was almost empty. Between the end of the war in 1953 and the end of the decade, Britain produced almost no novels, films, or substantial memoirs about Korea. The exception was A Hill in Korea, released in 1956, a film that gave early screen credits to a 19-year-old National Service infantryman from London named Michael Caine, who had served in Korea with the Royal Fusiliers. Caine recalled Chinese infantry advancing toward British positions. Thousands of soldiers led by troops of demonic trumpet players, the artillery opening up, but still they came on, marching toward the machine guns and certain death. The film, like the war, was forgotten. A survey conducted in 2001 gathered data from 994 British Korean War veterans using the Impact of Event Scale, a validated clinical instrument for measuring psychological symptoms consistent with post-traumatic stress. The combatants' scores clearly exceeded the scale's recommended cutoff level, decades after the war had ended. They had carried it home in silence because the country around them had not asked. Stephen Kelly, an oral historian, began interviewing Korean War veterans in the early years of this century. His first contact was the secretary of the British Korean War Veterans Association. His first words were these: "We're forgotten," he said. "Nobody remembers us and what we had to put up with." The Veterans Association has since been disbanded. There are no members left. In South Korea, the war is not forgotten. Hill 235 is still called Gloucester Hill. The South Koreans named it after the battle and have not renamed it since. In 2014, the Republic of Korea gifted Britain a memorial, a bronze statue of a British soldier, placed on Victoria Embankment in London outside the Ministry of Defence, to commemorate the more than 1,000 British service personnel who died in the conflict. The memorial was not commissioned by Britain. It was offered by the country Britain had fought for. It arrived 61 years after the war began. The Korean War technically never ended. No peace treaty was signed at Panmunjom. The armistice established a ceasefire and created the demilitarized zone, 155 miles long, the most heavily militarized border on Earth. North Korea is today a nuclear-armed state whose weapons program is a permanent feature of international security calculations. Every news cycle about North Korean missiles is, in a direct line, a consequence of what was not resolved in 1953. The men who held the Hook and the Imjin held them for a settlement that held and did not resolve, for a border that exists and was never agreed, for a conflict that stopped and did not end. South Korea is today a democracy of 52 million people with the 10th largest economy in the world. The memorial on Victoria Embankment was their idea. The country that sent the soldiers had not got around to it. The documents are not hidden. The regimental histories are published. The Oral History Archive from the University of Roehampton holds testimony from the last surviving British veterans. The Victoria Cross citations are in print. The casualty figures are precise: 1,106 killed in action or died of wounds, 2,674 wounded, 1,060 taken prisoner or listed as missing. These numbers have been available since the war ended. What has not followed from their availability is an accounting. 1,000 British soldiers came home from Korea in boxes from a war their country had already begun to forget while it was still being fought. The men who came home alive put their medals in drawers and answered questions about where Korea was. The South Koreans named a hill after the regiment that held it. Britain did not name anything. The record is precise. The reckoning is not in it. What do you think it costs a country to forget the men it sent to die? Tell me in the comments.